Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And if you grew up in the 90s and were a fan of animation, then you were often stuck with two choices. Either you watched the kind of kid-friendly cartoons that aired on Saturday morning, or you watched The Simpsons. There was anime, but it was still very niche and not widely available in the pre-internet era. And adult animation in general had not really matured beyond a certain point, so it was quite limiting to say the least. Now, there were some noteworthy efforts at more mature animated content, few are remembered today, but they still played a part in terms of helping the medium evolve. Without these shows, we wouldn't have the likes of Family Guy, South Park, BoJack Horseman, or Rick and Morty. And for me personally, I had my favorites during that time period. Yeah, I watched The Simpsons, but I was always on the lookout for other animated shows that weren't just geared towards kids. And of all the shows to come out during that particular era, The Critic really stood out. This was a show that attempted to capture the same tone and spirit of The Simpsons, but without coming off as an overt Simpsons ripoff. Created by Al Jean and Mike Reiss, The Critic took a different approach to characters, comedy, animation, and so much more. Now, the show only lasted 23 episodes over the course of 2 seasons. I still see it as one of those special shows that was ahead of its time. And even though it is very much a product of the mid-90s, its brand of comedy and narrative feel uniquely relevant. I would even go so far as to say that without The Critic, shows like Family Guy and South Park wouldn't have gotten a chance. Now, the story of how the show came to be is a bit messy, and it's largely because of that messiness that it only lasted for 2 seasons. But it had more going for it than most shows. Having accomplished writers from The Simpsons certainly helped raise its profile. But starting off on one network, ABC, and having to change over to Fox in the middle of season 1, that was more than a little disruptive. Now, the studio politics behind the situation aren't entirely known, but it's worth highlighting because it reveals just how much The Critic was at the mercy of circumstances. And yet, despite those circumstances, it still ended up being a great show by most measures. It follows the life, work, and mishaps of Jay Sherman, a portly but personable middle-aged man living in New York City. Voiced by John Lovitz, Jay's not married, but he starts off the show divorced and with a young son in Marty Sherman. And much of the show revolves around his job as a professional film critic. He hosts a show called Coming Attractions on the Phillips Broadcasting Cable Network, a powerful media entity owned by the colorful yet influential Duke Phillips, whose character, by the way, was partially inspired by Ted Turner. And while Jay Sherman is well-educated and articulate, he is often quite harsh in how he criticizes movies. It's perfectly reflected in his trademark line, "It stinks." But it's within this setup that the true heart and substance of The Critic really shines. Because, much like The Simpsons, the animated world of The Critic is very much a parody of the real world as we know it. But unlike The Simpsons, The Critic uses more classic cartoonish antics while still maintaining a fair amount of substance. This is a world where you see Jay Sherman make a genuine but impassioned plea for people to stop seeing bad movies, as well as a world where there's an entire camp dedicated to kids in need of an exorcism. That means in any given episode, you'll find something that appeals to fans of classic Looney Tunes style humor, as well as something that'll appeal to people seeking something more refined, relatively speaking. Now, that may not seem all that groundbreaking now, given the glut of adult animation we've seen since the mid-2000s. But in the early to mid-90s, this combination made The Critic truly unique. You weren't going to find this brand of comedy in any other show. And in addition to this comedy, you'll also find more serious plots and themes. Take the very first episode, for example. It presents a fairly basic plot that helps introduce us to Jay Sherman and his unique animated world. Within the first few minutes, we learn that he's somewhat jaded, being middle-aged, balding, obese, and divorced. And despite being on TV and rubbing elbows with celebrities, he's not exactly thriving, nor is he happy. Then an actress in an upcoming movie starts showing interest in him named Valerie Fox. She is very much a typical aspiring Hollywood actress. She's good-looking, she's flirty, and she's willing to do what she must in order to succeed, even if it includes getting romantic with Jay Sherman, one of the harshest film critics in the industry. Jay, being well aware of how unattractive he is to most women, eagerly buys into her advances. He's quick to proclaim his love for her even when she has a vested interest in winning his favor. Throughout the episode, This leads to plenty of comedic moments, and they take full advantage of this being an animated show, which helps keep the tone light, fun, and engaging. But there's still some drama within the story. Jay actively avoids seeing Valerie's movie, worried that if the movie stinks, like almost every other movie he sees, she'll stop loving him. And sadly, that does turn out to be the case. He still tries to be with her, but as soon as he has nothing left to offer her, she drops the act, and she is unapologetically harsh with him. It's sad for Jay because he clearly had feelings for this woman, but at the same time, Valerie's movie really did stink. And her acting was awful, even by the loosest of standards. The fact that Jay still delivered his harsh criticism, even when he had plenty of incentive to do otherwise, that just makes him more respectable. Yes, he is easily manipulated by a beautiful woman, but in the end, he does not compromise on his integrity as a critic. And that's actually a recurring theme throughout the show. Through many episodes involving many eccentric plots, Jay Sherman demonstrates that he is a man of principle. Yeah, he might be gullible, snobbish, and downright elitist at times, but there are lines he won't cross. And when the people he cares about need him, he will be there for them. He'll help them as best he can, despite his many limitations. And that's something else that the Critic does exceptionally well. It works to balance out the positive and negative aspects of Jay Sherman's character. Yes, he can be an oafish, snobby buffoon, especially when food is involved. But he can also be genuinely caring and kind to those he loves. When his son Marty becomes very self-conscious about his appearance, Jay agrees to go with him to a weight loss camp to improve his self-image. And while Jay is largely unable to benefit from it, he gladly does it for his son. It also leads to some very relevant insights into how much appearance affects how others see you, as well as how little acting skills matter in certain productions. Jay's commitment to others also extends beyond his family. When his charismatic boss, Duke Phillips, is diagnosed with a terminal illness, Jay takes it upon himself to help find a cure. The fact that he's neither a doctor nor a scientist only assures that plenty of cartoonish hilarity ensues. But that doesn't make Jay's motivations any less selfless. The fact that he ends up succeeding just helps belabor that he's far more capable than the Homer Simpsons and Al Bundys of the world. Even if you attribute that capability to traditional cartoonish tropes, it doesn't ultimately change the substance of the characters or the show. It just helps make that substance a lot funnier. On top of that, the substance is also allowed to evolve over time, something The Simpsons has never offered, having kept Bart and Lisa in the same grid for over 30 years. When season 2 of The Critic debuted, it lets Jay Sherman's personal life evolve, ensuring that he didn't stagnate as a perpetually single middle-aged man a la Seinfeld. And a big part of that evolution was the introduction of Alice Tompkins, a single mother trying to build a better life for herself and her daughter in New York. Initially, Jay offers to help her simply because she needed help. And despite him being a stranger in New York City, Alice accepts it. She soon comes to appreciate Jay on a personal level, and unlike Valerie Fox, that appreciation isn't just because she wants something out of him. Jay and Alice actually end up on a season-long arc that sees them evolve from friends to coworkers to a real honest romance. Despite their differences in both appearance and demeanor, it never comes off as forced. By the end of season 2, there's a real sincere connection between these two characters. Alice helps make Jay better both as a person and as a critic. And Jay helps make Alice better by taking a chance on her when others wouldn't. It's the kind of serialized drama that was rare for a show during that era, animated or otherwise. But The Critic found a way to make it work. And on top of that, it never let the drama get in the way of the comedy. Now granted, some of that comedy does not work outside of a 90s context. Due to its premise, The Critic relies heavily on pop culture references that might fly over the heads of people not familiar with that time period. But in some respects, the show really was canceled at the worst possible time. This was just before big, flashy cinematic spectacles like Titanic and Independence Day came out. It was also just a few years before superhero movies rose to prominence with X-Men, Spider-Man, and Batman Begins. This was also the early days of large-scale media consolidation. It was not obvious yet in the 90s, but many major movie studios were just starting to prioritize profitable, proven franchises with well-established actors. That might seem like cynical virtue signaling today, but through the lens of hindsight, it makes The Critic seem oddly prophetic. Say what you will about Jay Sherman and his callous takes on movies, but the movies he reviews, which happen to be parodies of real movies from that era, they really do stink. They're shallow, they're gimmicky, They basically throw familiar names and time-tested tropes into a movie and expect it to turn a profit while giving little care to actual substance. Does that sound familiar? While that might be a common criticism of nearly every YouTube critic today, Jay Sherman was a lot more blunt in his takes. He didn't just stop at saying that a movie stinks. He went a lot further in terms of criticizing the industry that makes these movies, as well as the audience who pays to see them. And over the course of the show, we see plenty of examples that vindicate his criticisms. We encounter movie executives and directors who are dumb, out of touch, and outright crazy at times. But the audience isn't off the hook either. When Jay finds out that audiences hate his show more than speeches from a certain German leader from the 1930s who shall go unnamed, he is rightly confused, because it sends the message that both the film industry and the audience have lost sight of what makes film meaningful. And unlike the Martin Scorseses of the world, Jay Sherman is a lot more measured in his takes. He doesn't blame one or the other, nor does he denigrate people as individuals. He blames the larger structures around the industry and society. Keep in mind, this is the 90s. Certain 90s nostalgia circles would have us believe that the current problems we see in movies and audiences today didn't exist. But they did. And Jay Sherman saw these problems in their earliest stages when it was still subtle. The rest of us just didn't notice until many years later, but by then, it was too late. It's enticing to wonder what the critic would do with the current state of the movie industry today, which is now dominated by live-action remakes, superhero movies, reboots, prequels, and spin-offs. And something tells me it just wouldn't be enough for Jay to say that they stink. And therein lies the real tragedy of the critic. It never got a chance to blossom like The Simpsons, Futurama, or Family Guy. In fact, the show's ratings were actually improving at the time it was canceled. There were even multiple scripts written for a third season. While it's hard to glean the full story of what happened to the show, the issue really came down to finding someone who was willing to support it. After Fox dropped it from their lineup, the show's creators tried hard to find another network. And in an era before multiple streaming platforms, their options were limited. Ultimately, the producers could not secure a partner, and the Critic just ended. And despite an attempt to revive the show as a flash animation short in the early 2000s, it just never got a chance. The fate of the show was tragic and more than a little frustrating, because the Critic had all the right ingredients to be the kind of show that stood the test of time. It was funny, it was well written, it had a talented cast of voice actors who were passionate about the show. It even had a relevant overarching message to share beyond being an animated comedy. The Critic really dared to criticize the very industry it was a part of, poking fun at and outright mocking Hollywood's many shallow practices. Throughout the show, Jay Sherman emphasized the importance of substance over spectacle. To him, just making movies flashy and marketable wasn't enough. There needed to be real art and story behind it. But doing so actually takes time, work, and effort. And those within the industry, as well as the general public, they just aren't willing to commit to that. In that sense, maybe it's not too surprising that the Critic was ultimately canceled, because the criticism it offered, as funny as it was, might have hit a little too close to home. The fact that Jay Sherman's many criticisms have only become more relevant with time just helps us appreciate a show like that even more. Because no matter the decade, no matter the era, and no matter how outdated the pop culture references might be, most of us can agree. We want to be entertained, thrilled, and enchanted at the movies. Or at the very least, we just don't want our movies to stink. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, take care and stay safe.